All right, and welcome back to the Self-Selecting Podcast, episode 23. 23rd episode. We're doing it. More PED talk today. You guys have been leaving a lot of feedback on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcast. I see it. I appreciate it. Real quick, before we get started, if you were listening in from Spotify or Apple and you haven't, I know a lot of you have, but if you haven't, do me a favor and leave a review, rate the show 5 stars, please, if you think it is 5-star worthy. If you were here from YouTube, you're watching, you are avid follower of the podcast, tuning in to these weekly episodes, which, by the way, gonna be having some guests on, recording tomorrow with Alex Bush. Then I got Justin Mahaly, got him coming on end of July, 2 of the several guests coming on here in the next couple weeks. Very excited for that. If you were here tuning in from YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. It helps a ton. It helps so much. It helps more than you would think. And I appreciate it. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate Algorithm Gang. Those of you who are just tuning in, let me know, hey, I like this. I like what you're putting out. Keep putting out more of it. Thank you. As always, if you're interested in coaching, I've got the links to that in the show notes down below. Coaching, you do not have to be a competitor. You can be someone who's like, hey, I like what you do. I like the content that you bring to Instagram and YouTube and the interweb, but I'm not interested in bodybuilding. I support you doing bodybuilding, I support other people doing it, but I'm not looking to be on stage in any kind of form or fashion, but I'd like to work with you. I'd like to get into better shape. I know we're by the time this is launched, middle of July, it probably seems like it's too late. It probably seems like we're at the point where it's like, you know what, fuck it, let's just give up. Let's throw in the towel. Let's enter the intentional growth phase. You can, and I can definitely help you with that. But if you're interested in losing body fat, can also help you with that. Coaching information. We got to do a one-time consultation call. It is free, 15 minutes. Just give me a feel for what you're looking for. Get a feel for what kind of coach I am, what kind of coaching I offer. Information to that is in the show notes below. And lastly, consultations. Yes, I'm still taking consultation inquiries for the month of July. I have a few slots open. I'm going to be traveling a little bit starting the 19th. Got the Ikaika. Wow. Beautiful. Ikaika seminar here on the 20th. It's going to be in Honolulu. If you're going to be at that show, definitely be there. Be at the seminar between pre-judging and night show. It's going to be fun. Alan reached out about a month ago, maybe about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, asked if I would come and speak, and not just speak about birth control, not just speak about women's hormones. He asked if I would speak about PEDs, specifically anabolics. So that is what we're doing. I'm so excited that I get the opportunity to speak at an NPC event about drugs, about PEDs. I get to use all the words, get to give you guys what you're looking for. So if that's something that you're going to be in town for. I mean, if you're not going to be in town, like, what better reason to go out to Hawaii for the weekend? Come through. Come see the seminar. We're going to do like 45 minutes of presentation. The content, guys, is long. It's long and it can be dry. It can be dry for even people who are interested in it. So, I mean, like, really, when we start getting into like the almost an hour-long seminars, lectures, I mean, they can be pretty lengthy, as you see at the end of the podcast. Solo podcast. I'm just trying to make it through towards the end. It would be an intermission would be nice, but for efficiency's sake, I'm just going to keep powering through with caffeine as needed. So with that, 45 minutes of lecture going over drugs, going over actual drug talk, and then turning it over to an open Q&A, which frankly, the open Q&As, like I think through that, a lot of people learn, I would say just as much in that segment. In my experience, like those portions of like seminars, lectures have made it to where people can obviously consume, listen, digest whatever information I've presented thus far, but then that in itself is an opportunity for viewers, for attendees to then see in real action based on everything I just laid out, how this information can be applied. And I think this honestly is what has allowed me, I would say allow me the greatest degree of learning is doing consultations where, every time it's something different and there are very specific needs to that individual. And even though, yes, the framework, there are similarities and there are general guidelines we should follow, there are conditions that arise that make it exciting. So if you're going to be in Honolulu, or if you're not going to be in Honolulu and you want something to do, the 20th of July, I will be doing that at the Ikaika Classic between prejudging and night show. So any questions around that, leave them in the comments below. I will plug that information as well. Okay. So what are we talking about today? So recently, 3 days ago, I was having a conversation, and this has now become something that I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool to look back on and to compare and contrast. And someone asked me, what were the differences really in like the 2021 prep versus the 2022 prep? So for new listeners, for those of you who don't know, in 2021 I turned pro, which at this point seems like forever ago. So long ago. I started competing I started my first prep in 2014. Did my first show January 2015. So right around that time, I was a teen competitor in the NPC. Got back into competing in 21. Had previously done a few different seasons. He did well, but 2020 got back into it. Competed in both wellness and bikini, did well in both. Oddly was encouraged to go to wellness, which is laughable at this point, but I digress. When I went into the 2021 season, it was after doing 2 national shows. So I did 2 national shows in 2020. I did well at my first national show, NPC Nationals. If you aren't familiar, that show, they give away 2 pro cards per class. And I got 3rd, and I was 1 point away from getting 2nd. And I think that matters. I think that context is important because whenever we're talking about decision-making around drugs, this is something that the context is everything. The first thing that you need to do if you are on the brink of making that jump from being a natural athlete to becoming an enhanced athlete, you really have to start with a checklist and understanding, okay, what are the needs of the division that I'm competing in, that I'd like to compete in? Do I have the ability to see out these goals without the use of PEDs? Or in a large part, can I see out most of my goals without the use of PEDs or with very minimal PEDs? And you know what I mean? Like you kind of, there's a whole checklist in the free ebook on my website. You go to my website, hit your email in there, send you a link, subscribe. Okay. Then you have the download link. You're redirected. I don't know. You can then download the free ebook in which there is a checklist, a yes and no checklist. It's like, I don't know, it's like 12, 14 questions, something like that. And you can go through, and this is like your decision-making around starting PEDs. But one of the questions that I think I don't know if it actually is on the checklist, but I've talked about in webinars historically is how competitive are you? Do you have evidence to support that you are generally a competitive athlete, that you are someone who can see out these goals, period? The hard part about this sport is, like genetically, there is a structure per division that allows for, I would say, an easier time, easier journey, allows for better placing with less work. In the bikini division, hey, like you are built like clavicularly, you got broad clavicles. Okay, you're not going to need as much delt, let's say, versus someone who is a little more up and down. Like the width that they bring to stage, or just I guess have and walking around day-to-day life, everyday life, it is just very up and down, just very straight, not a lot of not a high degree of difference in shoulders to waist to hips. Okay, that's someone who they might have to technically build more muscle in order to see out their goals. So you have that aspect of the structure. You have even the genetic aspect. Are you someone who is kind of like fighting against the clock? Are you starting competing later in life and you were competing against people who are, maybe 10, 15, 20 years younger than you? Then you have the other aspect. It's like, hey, how do you actually fare in competition? What is your ability as an athlete to get on stage and perform and put forth the things that you need to do? I mean, even if you're not someone who came from a theater, gymnastic, cheer, dance background, can you get on stage and do the thing that you need to do? Can you display your physique? Or is that the hardest part? Is the hardest part getting on stage and displaying it? Are you just very uncomfortable with that? Hey, I'll tell you, that was me. And that is me. Present tense. This is the part that it's not my favorite part. It's not the part that I enjoy the most. I like the getting lean part the most. That part is really fun. I like the training part. The training part is also fun. The displaying, the actual competition, there are aspects to it I enjoy, but the actual presentation, that's not my favorite part. And if that's something that you are not very versed in, if that's something that frankly you're just hey, your nerves or your mindset around getting on stage and presenting yourself, if that is such a disadvantage to where it then hinders your ability to place better, okay, that is a component in this needs analysis. I know that was pretty lengthy, but for those of you hung in there on that very long-winded, super compound idea, thank you. In the essence of someone who has high aspirations and wants to compete in a division that has a high degree of muscularity, and they're not good at presenting their physique on stage, they've competed and yet they find that they're just somehow some aspect of what they're presenting on stage they're missing the mark on. So thereby they're not placing, they're not missing a win or missing a second place by 1 or 2 spots. Okay, well, this is something that we need to consider for ourselves as athletes as well as coaches. What is the likelihood that if we put drugs in place that this is going to make any kind of meaningful difference in this individual's career, in their career path? And I say career because I think journey to it's so overused, but in your experience as a competitor, is this going to make a difference? And I think we really have to take placing in prior competition history, which is the Cliff Notes way that I could have just said that without taking y'all on this tangent. If that individual is showing a track record that, indicates, hey, maybe they are at a regional level, they're getting 5th, 6th, 7th, they're struggling to even get into first callouts. Even in first callouts, there's visually, maybe they do place well, maybe they place 3rd or 4th, but you can just see. You can see in the physiques 1st and 2nd, you can see that there's a really big gap, whether that be in muscularity, which is a bigger issue, or conditioning, which is a correctable issue. But I mean, depending on the athlete, that could be a bigger issue. This is a pretty significant part in how we make those decisions around whether it's appropriate to put the drugs in place. Now, I had drugs in my 2020 season. I had Anavar in place before I competed at the Cal because I was I'm interested in trying this. I'm interested in putting a PED, an anabolic, in place. Was it premature? Yeah, it was premature. When I went into those national shows, we actually removed Anavar because of that feedback that, hey, you might be wellness, which at the time, very funny, but realistically, we're going off the feedback. They're hey, you're on the cusp of both. Just for anyone who's were you? No, I wasn't. I was tiny. I was very small. But I took the Anavar out because that was the feedback we were given. Wanted to do well at the national level, so that meant bringing the look that the judges told me to bring. So I brought that look. I brought a more bikini, a very distinct bikini look. I forget. I had T4, T3N. I don't think I had clean. This is with Andrew. This was with Walker. So, but yeah, I don't think I had clean. No. I didn't have clean. Yeah, use some Nolvadex. And like, I mean, realistically, was I even lean enough for that to even make a difference? No, not really. I did well. My first national show was 1 point away from a pro card, which was exciting. And I mean, like the feedback from the judges is like, hey, little tighter in the tie-ins, presentation's good. I mean, like to me, I'm like, I always want that to be better, just given that it's not something that does come naturally to me, not something that comes natural. And I know that like it's going to be valuable to continue to build up that skill, as it is not a skill that I just innately am gifted in. Next show I did, I mean, there were a couple things going on, but did come in leaner. I did have less muscle, and it was interesting because Andrew, like, still remember to this day, he was right. He was like, we should probably keep Anavar in place, and at the time, like, this wasn't this exact wording, but it was like, hey, like, you will fare better, like, having a fuller look because these girls are more muscular than you. You will appear leaner, having more projection, And I was like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable. And Andrew was one of my best friends. Like, I mean, he was coaching me at the time, but like, I was very like, bold and like, I'm just not comfortable having it in place, continuing like into this show because I think it's going to hinder my look. I was wrong. I think it could have enhanced my look. It looked very, very flat, very stringy. And that was kind of the feedback I got. My tan was also pretty yuck. I was not a fan of that. Got 5th at that show. So, I mean, dropped a few placings. From there, I went and worked with Shane Hughley, which those of you who've been following, y'all know. Like, I mean, I worked with him, got ready for junior USAs. So did, NPC, USAs, same thing there. Top 2, get pro cards. Wasn't the outcome I wanted, but I mean, I didn't do bad. It's just like for like a not as good look, like I dropped a few placings. Okay, well, let's hit the next circuit of national shows. And that was in December. That was, I want to say like early December, like the 10th or something like that. It was really strict with like my macros and like, I mean, just generally cardio and like monitoring like for excessive body fat gain and going into that next season with Shane. I mean, I was like, literally like, I'll do whatever it takes. I want to defer to an expert. And at the time I was very much like, oh, this is someone who's very good at this. And like, Shane, like I was very communicative with him in that I wanted to understand what it meant to get as lean as I needed to be. I wanted to train my eye for that. And going into that prep, I mean, like I was very honest, like, hey, like I can do a lot. I've historically done a lot of this myself. I overthink, type A, I just overly analytical, probably just like wasting a lot of energy on these areas. But I have a lot of information. Like I can bring you a lot of information that could, maybe make your job easier. I don't know. That prep was very different. That prep, like I know people will say, well, like, they've been on these protocols or they've heard these protocols from different teams. And like, it's not my place to like point fingers and be like, oh, I don't know the context. All I can speak to is like my experience is like, even with him, I didn't use a lot of drugs. Like I used drugs, yes, but arguably it's not that they were the best drugs. They weren't the correct drugs, but the amounts were reasonable. Like it wasn't excessive. And that's something I want to be really clear about. Cause I think in the past when I've talked about that prep, people have kind of ran with it and been like, you abuse drugs. Like, no, still pretty underwhelming. Still nothing that you're going to get excited about. But really, like when I was working on like my, my presentation for the seminar, and one of the slides, like I'm using that comparison from 2021 to 2022. And like it occurred to me, like at my peak weight in 21, my peak weight in 22, I started roughly around, my peak weights were roughly around the same, as were my ending weights. Yet the look was completely different. The look was one in that I was much, much leaner in 22, 21. And when I think back, and this isn't like here's the thing I want to be really clear about. This isn't a knock at the coaching. Like ultimately I take on a lot of personal responsibility when it comes to like, if you think what your coach has you do is not sound, if you think that there's a better way, or you need clarification, or you think like, hey, based on the current timeline, like there's no way I'm going to be ready in time, that's on you to speak up. And if what they come back with is like, okay, well, here's our game plan. What would you like to do? Like it ultimately, it's not just like you just submitting to them and doing whatever it is they say. Like in that case, like you can't, it's not to say you can't be mad. There are a lot of people who end up in that position where truly, like, they're just ignorant to how bad their protocols actually are. But there's a lot of information, especially now, especially in 2024, like that was 21, like there was still some information, not a lot, but now like there are 3 years, like bikini talk on Reddit. Like there's a lot of people who are disclosing things that have worked, things that haven't worked, the results, the outcomes of certain drug use, certain prep approaches. I would highly recommend that subreddit. Like again, grain of salt. There's some silly people in there that just say things that like, that's not correct. But there's some good information. So anyways, kind of getting back into the point of this video today. When I look at those pictures, when I look at the changes I made in a year, sure, maybe there was a little bit of muscle built. Between the seasons, I did start TRT after I ended the 21 season. I had been on DHEA the duration of that season because my test was low, all my hormones were low. But past that, I was like, okay, like if this is what I need to have in place, okay, that's one thing, but is there something better? And if I turned pro, I did well at my pro debut. I got second to Ashley K at a point, like it was really good objectively, but I knew I was like, okay, like if I'm going to play the game, if I'm going to do things like better than I've previously done, I need to be educated. And if this involves drugs, I need to understand the risk that I'm taking. And that is really what led me to consult with John Jewett and like, hey, look, can you look at my blood work? Can you tell me what I'm doing? Can you tell me if this is what you would have me do if you were working with me? Started TRT. I think I started TRT. Was it like November? Yeah. Like looking back, I've been using December as my, okay. So started TRT December. I finished competing in like July, like end of July. So there was some time in between where I was like, let me just stop DHEA, see where my natural levels are at. I'm putting TRT in place, having him do my training, being on a training program. Like, yeah, gosh, okay, so let me walk that back because it's really like 6 months, including the post-show period. So there wasn't a lot of time in between. So any muscle that was built, it was, I don't want to say negligible because a pound is a pound, but it wasn't a true like intentional like growth phase in the way that I've done now at this point. And that's okay. Like, I knew going into 22 prep, John was very clear. My boyfriend at the time, they were both like, yeah, you're not as muscled as you need to be competitive to qualify for the Olympia. No, like, these girls are really dense. And if you would like to stand like toe to toe with them and like you want to objectively win, not just get lucky, not just skate by, you need more muscle. Now, because of where I was at in my career path, I was starting the clinical portion of nursing school. I was like, well, honestly, like, yes, but also I'm probably not going to compete for another 2 years. So I'd like to like take another swing at like seeing how I do on the pro stage, a little fresh, not through like a really rough season, which if you followed my 21 prep, like I got very lean. Yes. But at what cost? Like there were a lot of strategies taken that I believe were avoidable. And that's really the point of this video. 28 minutes in or whatever we're at, 26, 24. There were a lot of things that I did in that 21 prep that I would not recommend and I would not do again. Like, those were extremes and very much to compensate for poor planning. Now, I think when I, come on here and I'm like, hey, you have all the information that you need at the beginning. Like what is going on? Like, why are you fucking it up so bad? It comes from a place of like, I get being off slightly. I get going into like the final 2 weeks and you're like, hey, like we need to dig a little bit. Like you're not where you need to be. What I don't get is being off like 7 to 10 pounds. That's what really irks me, because like, hey, I coach, like I get it. There are some weeks where I'm exhausted and I'm like, yo, like, okay, this client, I need to like dig back into previous responses because I'm not quite sure where we're at. And I'm like, okay, let me reorient, make sure I have all of the necessary information. This is okay. This is what we talked about previously. That happens. I think if I had to theorize, and it's not to say this is what's happening, but I think oftentimes there is a laziness that comes with coaching, because you're just like, okay, well, this client didn't make progress. So all I need to do is just tell them to like be adherent, just be on plan, just do the things that I'm telling you to. And that's like the easy example is like when someone's non-adherent. But what about like when someone just didn't lose weight? And I think like looking back at my prep in 21, there were a lot of weeks, because it was the same. It was about 20 pounds ish, give or take. And if I have these correct, which I'm open to being wrong, the dieting started sometime like middle to end of February, maybe like in beginning of March. And then Junior USA's was May 10th, May 15th, somewhere around that. So it's like there was a good amount of time to lose weight, but not at the rate that I would need to. Like I would have needed to lose like 2 pounds a week, so 1,000 calorie deficit a day. And there were definitely some weeks where weight wasn't dropping. And I remember in maybe it was like end of March, beginning of April, there was a point where I talked to my coach and I was like, yeah, like I am a little nervous. Like I want to make sure that I'm ready for this show. Like I'm putting everything I have into it. This is the hardest prep I've done. Like it's the leanest I've gotten. And like, just, okay, sidebar. If you've never been stage lean, if you are trying to achieve a level of conditioning that is foreign to you, understand that that is going to require, and I'm not going to say it's going to require a new version of you. It's like, no, I'm not saying that. It's going to require tolerating a level of discomfort that you probably can't imagine. Because ultimately that's going to look different for you, your situation, how you manage that fatigue. But for me at the time, like, I mean, a lot of the stress itself, like I was in online classes, work was really light at the time, but like at the time, the stress was all intrinsic. Like I was creating that stress and it came from the pressure that I was putting on myself. And this is something like, I know a lot of clients I work with, they come to me, they're like, I don't know how to manage my stress. Like externally, cool, that's one thing, but what's happening internally, that's just how I've always been. I don't know any other way. Looking back, I got much leaner the following year. Much leaner. And yes, it was largely in part to giving myself enough time. So I had wiggle room when weeks it didn't pan out the way I hoped. Like I didn't see the rate of change I was aiming for. But what also really like made a difference was managing that intrinsic stress. So really getting clear on like, okay, this is self-created. This is something that is in a way almost indulgent because it's going to allow me to sit in this feeling, ruminate, stay here, not consider the effects of sitting in this feeling. And it's not one of those things where I'm like, oh, just like disassociate, just like avoid what it is you're experiencing. I'm not saying that. I don't think that's helpful. At the time I kind of did, but really what helped me manage that stress was considering, okay, I have this plan. This plan is very objective. It is backed by a lot of logic. I've gone through and I've considered, okay, what if I don't lose at the rate that I need to? So I have additional weeks built in. So the worst case scenario is if I continue to hit a stall, I have these other tools. I have increases in my non-androgenic PEDs that I can escalate. I have the ability to escalate cardio. I have the ability to pull food down further. And it came honestly from starting that 2022 prep and being very clear that like, hey, I have an objective to meet this target rate of change every week. And if I don't hit that, sure, there's the chance that is like an artificial inflation and like it's my period, whatever. But it's also possible. It's not impossible. that I'm just not in a big enough deficit. Now, knowing that the first week and seeing that like I didn't lose at the rate I was hoping to, I pulled food down. And I know I talked about this like the last episode as well, but like I was like, this is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable because I have 20 weeks, like roughly, maybe even longer. I have 20 weeks or so left of this prep. And if I'm already pulling food down, like what is that going to leave me with? But what I did do is ensure that food wasn't my only tool. I didn't pull food down to 1100. I didn't have cheat meals or like untracked meals in place so that like, okay, like, yeah, you're at like 1400, but at the same time, you're undoing that deficit with these free meals that are supposed to, be used to drop off dietary fatigue. I made sure as much as I could that everything was accounted for or could be accounted for. That wasn't really the case in 21. In 21, there were several weeks where I was short. And it's not like we didn't have a timeline. We didn't have a target rate of change. It was like the goal is just get you peeled, get you as lean as you need to be, make it, undeniable that you're the best on stage. And I don't disagree with that approach. I mean, because ultimately we can shoot for a weight, we can shoot for, a target. But if we get there and that's not good enough, we might have to pivot. And in 21, there were several weeks where I could see him like, okay, like my tines are not coming in. So food, maybe food would go down. Cardio would go up. Now, the main issue that I found is that cardio was going up at a much faster rate than food was coming down. Food was relatively high. Yeah, I was tracking macros. I was flexible dieting. Also flexible dieted in 22. So a constant variable, not a variable. Yeah, it was a fixed variable. Gosh, that's embarrassing. When I look back though, in 21, I still was very food focused because I was coming off the prep from 2020. I was coming off, and really I started that one, in like August through December. I was like in a prep mode, whether food was higher, body fat was a little higher at certain points. I was in prep mode. I didn't take really any time off. I went straight from the holidays into another prep. So it was at that point, like almost 11 months in totality of like dieting. So even though I'm like, yeah, this is what I want, like the hunger signaling was very dysregulated at that point. I also was in a position where the drugs I was taking were making the day-to-day that much worse. Like Nolvadex, y'all know how I feel about it. If you watched episode 22, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that it's magic. I think if anything, it's put in place to compensate for people who are behind in terms of fat loss. Just put this in place. Okay. Like, visually there might be maybe an improvement theoretically. Like I'm not saying it's going to do something that isn't already happening, but I know some people are like, hey, like my estrogen is high, so bringing it down, that did help me. That did help cosmetically, but yes, so would losing body fat. Losing body fat would also help you. And depending on how high it is, there is the chance that estrogen isn't the issue. And that's not the reason that you're not losing body fat. It's just that you're not in a big enough deficit. But when I really pull back and consider, okay, what were the things that dug me into such a hole in that 21 prep? I mean, the biggest one was escalating cardio to a point that very quickly I couldn't recover from it. So, I mean, cardio was moving up at a very fast rate on account of the coach giving me the option. I'm hungry. I like food. Like, I'm very hungry. Hunger is dysregulated. I want to be adherent. So can we just keep the food in? So cardio was pushed up. At the time, I wasn't doing stairs. I was doing incline treadmill. So, I mean, my heart rate was still pretty high because I was at 15%. But frankly, like having that luxury to decide, I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the foresight to be like, ooh, yeah, like eventually there's a point in which training will be impacted from this. And every training session, like moving forward, every training session is going to be that much harder and going to do less and less for me from a muscle retention standpoint, which then leads you into a bigger problem. Luckily, I had a lot of DHEA in place. So, I mean, like 100 milligrams DHEA, my test was sitting nicely. It was at like 70, 78 nanograms per deciliter. It was good. But that in itself, like maybe that offered some kind of like muscle retentive coverage, but at the same time, just the fact that my training performance over the course of several months was going down, like it was declining. And like, I mean, really, like Shane deferred to me for training. He's like, do what you're doing. Do what you're doing is working. Like, don't change anything. Like, I know other clients of his have gotten training programs and like, okay, I didn't get one from him. So I was just like going in, I'm like fucking doing so much volume, just anything to get a pump, to try to push what I thought was heavy loads at the time. But I was buried in the amount of fatigue that had accumulated thus far because of the cardio, because of the fact that even initially, even if we say like conservatively, okay, middle of February, middle of March, middle of April, middle of May. So that's 1 pound a week. But frankly, like, I don't think it wasn't middle of February. It really like, I know like, gosh, Junior USA's early May. Yeah. Like I've done the math before and I'm like, there's no way without being in like a 800 to 1200 calorie deficit on average, obviously 1,000 calorie deficit a day, that I would have been ready in time. And that really was, what irked me when I reflected back. I'm like, oh, like this was never going to work. And it wasn't like hard to come to that conclusion. Like it literally is it's simple math. This was always going to be something that we had to rush into. And I remember my birthday so my birthday, a week out, I was like telling, Patrick, I'm like, my tie-ins are not in. Like, I don't feel confident about where I'm at. I just like, I know I'm really lean, like my core, my upper body, sure, but my tie-ins aren't there. Like, and I think at the time, gosh, I know I was over 125. Like there was a point early May where I was like 127 and I still had an additional 5 pounds to lose over the course of like, I want to say like 2 weeks to 10 days, something like that. And it was so defeating. And it was the stress then of going into the show and trying to be like, okay, well, you had 5 months to, and I guess not, because you had 4 months to get ready for this show. Like what happened? It's not like you just knew May 1st, like you were doing the show 2 weeks later. And that to me, like that was a guilt and shame thing that like I felt like I needed to bear, even though it's not helpful. It just like, it felt very embarrassing to be like, damn, like I busted my ass and it wasn't enough. Like it wasn't good enough. And then the stress of wondering, what is this going to translate to on stage? Like, what is this going to translate to in terms of placing? And I've talked about this like in several podcasts, some of my own, some others, about how like, honestly, going into that show, I lacked a lot of confidence. And it was because I knew I wasn't ready in time. And I knew that like everything that I needed to do on stage to place well felt like it was a compensation. Whereas if I had been like as lean as I needed to be, let's say May 1st, 2 weeks before the show, well, then we could have eased up on the cardio. Guys, it was like the Thursday before. I was like at the gym doing 90 minutes, 2 hours of cardio, somewhere in the mix of that. But like all of peak week, like I was doing so much cardio, I was eating so little. And I'm like, the fuck? Like, oh my God, we had so much time. Like what happened? 22 from week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. I was constantly pivoting based on what was happening in real time, based on how recovery was, based on how high or how fast hunger was escalating. Yes, I dropped food. I went from an average of 15, went from an average of like 1620 down to like, I think 1500, something like that. Then down to 1400. And like collectively, I was like, okay, like this is what feels like kind of aggressive. But at the same time, I'm doing 30 minutes of cardio 7 days a week. Like I can coast there for a little bit. Like I'm probably not going to have to go to 60 minutes to get things to move if I control food, which is going to be a little bit more accurate in driving that deficit. I felt good. Like I felt good about like adding in the non-androgenic PEDs. I'm like, okay, like fat loss isn't moving as quickly as I'd like. But at the same time, like I took a trip to Texas for like 5 days in February. So within the first month, I was still, I was on track, but like obviously discrepancies in different food sources. I had the trip to Tulum at the end of March, I think. That was like 4 or 5 days, which, really did stress me out. But at the same time, I was like, okay, like I know that even with these things, even with these what seem like very big obstacles at this point, I am still much closer and I still feel more prepared than I did at any point throughout my 21 prep. So I'm like, okay, like even if I start to stall, let's just use that stall. Even if I start to see that the rate of loss is slower, okay, well, I can continue to escalate cardio. And like at my peak, I was doing 60 minutes, 7 days a week, but it wasn't like 60 minutes of 15% incline. Like there were times at the point where it was getting up really, really high, brought the incline back down. Speed was about 3 miles an hour. Like this is a much different modality of cardio versus something like Stairmaster or doing like any kind of HIIT training, HIIT cardio. And frankly, like what I was able to see is even though I had these travel arrangements, like I had these travel plans, I still like went into, let's see, did Night of Champions. That was like about the same time. So May 15th, got to the point where I was like, okay, early, middle of April, about a month out. I'm like, I'm close. Like I'm already in like the 126, 127. Like I can still push it from here. And that was a really good feeling because I knew at the time, I'm like, yo, like a year ago, this is where I was starting peak week. And I did not look this way. Like I did not, I was so tired and like fatigue was so high. And largely this was coming from intrinsically, I was like, I'm not ready. I have put forth this amount of effort and I'm not where I need to be. Like, what did I do wrong? To be able to have, I would say really the opposite experience, a complete 180 from that, where I was able to be like, yeah, I am a month out and I have plenty of time. And if something does go wrong, if I do get sick, if I get injured, like I still have an appropriate amount of tools at this point. Yes, I've used some of them, but I have some tools in the bank that I can cash in for. And I can be like, okay, yeah, like we're going to dig a little bit. And going into that show, like, yes, I was nervous and I was like, I wonder how I'm going to do. And like the girls look a lot bigger and I'm bringing a different shape, but like this is an improved look. It's way too lean for what it needed to be. But for the level of muscularity I had, it was good. It was very good. I was very proud of my performance that show, despite getting 7th, despite not placing as well. I was better prepared with my posing. I felt more confident in like the peaking approach. I felt like, okay, even though these things aren't perfect, because like that's the thing, I look back at pictures, I'm like, oh, like I wish I had done this differently. Like, okay, I wish my the tan was like a disaster. It was so muddy, dark, and there was like so much glitter in like the coat. But like honestly, looking back at that show, I was so happy with the process. I was so happy with the approach I took, because like ultimately this is something that like it goes against the idea of like, no, I'm competitive and like I care about the bottom line and like I get it. Okay, fucking relax. But you have to remember what we're doing. We're in a sport that is highly subjective. There is not a means in which people can be judged truly on an equal playing field because of structure, because of age, and like I'm talking about like in the open category, but like truly there is so much that is subjective, even in like, okay, it's not the same athletes every show. Some of the judges, they're very insistent. Like, no, like we're all aligned. Yeah, like, yes, I believe that they're aligned, but it doesn't mean that there aren't discrepancies judge to judge, East Coast to West Coast to Midwest to South. Like, I mean, there are discrepancies in what wins, and that is largely based on who shows up. And it's based on like that person who shows up, and whether the judges like that look on them or whether they're like, Corey, it's a little much. Like, why did you come like this? So at the end of the day, like remembering, okay, this is a very subjective sport. All you can do is show up extremely prepared. Yes, like adhering to, sure, the criteria, if you want to say that, but it really is bringing the best you. I'm hesitant to say like move away from the criteria. That's not at all what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying, but ultimately you have to work with what you can bring to stage. And if that can resemble what the criteria ask for, amazing. But frankly, for some people, like even just bringing their best like that, that's what they need to do. And if that is being like overly conditioned, okay, well, like you don't have the muscularity. This is a better look than showing up, let's say, softer. Yeah, like I can get on board with that. I think you have to remember that like there's a lot that comes from just being in the sport, being put under this amount of stress for this kind of duration. You learn a lot about yourself. I've learned so much about myself through being in the sport of bodybuilding. I've learned so much about having, like, forcing myself to get up on stage. Like, believe it or not, I just stage fright public speaking. That's always been something that has really been hard for me to get over. And getting up and like being like in a suit and stuff and like having to display your physique and being there paying money, suffering. Yes, suffering. It's fucking hard. Suffering for several months, in and out of the gym, like 24 hours, like you're in a position where you're making decisions. Does this bring a better physique and overall potential outcome to stage? Yes, doing that for several months at a time. Ultimately, to be told, like, here's what we think you could do better. Like, yes, beautiful X, Y, and Z. Yes, you did this good, but here's why we can't award you better placing. That part is out of your control. All you can do is become, as welcoming to the feedback, while also keeping a very careful lens on how it applies to you and what it might actually mean. But remember that, like, this ultimately, it can be something that allows you to develop several skills within your umbrella of like personal growth. But the placing, that is one component. It doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't cover the intangibles and what you go through in a contest prep. So like, I think that yes, contest prep, it can be very beneficial. You can gain a lot from it if you are ready to gain a lot from it. There's a lot of people who don't gain anything from contest prep and they leave feeling slighted. They feel like they were robbed. And I think this is even more telling, when you have someone who handles the placing and when the placing is different than what they were hoping for, and they handle it poorly. They're very vocal that they feel like they deserved better placing. Ultimately, you gotta like have good sportsmanship and remember like what we're doing is very silly. Like we're creating artificial stress, an artificial environment for us to suffer, and like that's a privilege. And like, yeah, I know like people they kind of live in one camp or the other. They're like, okay, like the sport is dumb, or no, the sport is everything. And I'm not saying, I'm not really joining either here. This sport is not everything to me. This is a very small part of my identity. Sport is not dumb. I'll poke fun, and I love going in on some of the sillier parts of the sport because, like, fucking come on, lighten up. But if you want to gain something from it, if you want to use it as means to push yourself, you absolutely can. And I encourage you to do that if you've kind of like peaked in terms of what you've been able to get through just, I don't know, recreationally modifying, altering your body composition, etc. I think it could be a good opportunity, be a good way to challenge yourself. Anyways, I hope you guys like this episode. Hope it was helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one.